What's up, everyone? Today I wanted to go over another video by the Distraction Makers, a channel based around the discussions between a AAA dev and a more indie kind of newer dev talking about game design and mechanics. And they've put out a lot of videos recently about Magic the Gathering, and I think this is the one that really blew them up and started putting them on my feed based on what I looked through on their channel. And I really wanted to go over it because it's about why is the strategy of Magic the Gathering so different than maybe other games. And I think this can maybe help us inform ourselves about maybe fire design, some of the things that's going on in the landscape right now. And it's really interesting to, I guess, take this from the angle of game designers that aren't working on Magic but play Magic and work on other games. So let's see what they have to say about, you know, a game that's been having a lot of controversy recently, but also has a lot of
making
positivity
decisions
too.
With imperfect information equals needing to build heuristics for these scenarios and then making the best decision you can based on the unknowns, the could-be's, and that's strategy.
Distraction makers.
Strategy, okay.
Okay, so what are heuristics? It's a way of thinking. We're talking about it in reference to strategy games. Specifically, we're going to talk about Magic the Gathering because that's what I am most familiar with.
Yeah.
So a great example of a Magic heuristic is what's called Bolt the Bird.
Right.
Okay, so
like
what does that mean, right? Outside of people who don't play Magic, that's going to be convoluted. All right, so there's a spell called Lightning Bolt, which is where bolt comes from. And there's a card called Birds of Paradise, which is where bird comes from. So the saying bolt the bird means that you should play your lightning bolt against your opponent's Birds of Paradise.
Right.
And so they'll probably go over it in a second, but really, I think what they're going to be talking about is the idea of card advantage and mana and how that works in Magic, right? So if your opponent has a Birds of Paradise out or a mana dork, they play it on turn 1. On turn 2, they will have 3 mana, which is 0.5 more than what you'll have, right? And so, you know, on turn 2, you're going to have 2 mana. They're going to have 3, right? They're going to be at like 1.5 times you. Then on the turn after, like let's say they play another mana dork, then they're going to be at like more than that, almost double the amount of mana that you could potentially have as well. So this is where things start to scale out of control, and the things that they can do in the game are very different from what you can do in the game. So it's very important to use your removal to keep that advantage even, especially as like mid-range decks. Like in Modern, we might think of traditionally like Jund that plays Fatal Push and removal. Like you bolt the bird, you remove the bird so that you are working on the same the same axis, I should say, with your opponent. Especially as a burn player, that can be very important because it makes it so your opponent can't get to your burn answers faster. So you ultimately have to use a resource that doesn't attack their life, but keeps the playing field even so that they don't answer you as fast. And you can apply pressure and make them make different decisions that way.
Why should you do that? Okay, so what Birds of Paradise does is for one resource, right, in this case, a green mana, you play a creature that then on their next turn can be utilized as though it's another resource, right? So
Right.
they're skipping ahead a turn, effectively.
Right. Yep.
So that
Very
instead of
powerful when
having
you think
2
about it like
resources
that.
on turn 2, they're going to have 3 resources on turn 2.
Which doesn't sound like a big deal if you don't play Magic, but if you do play Magic, you'll understand it's a big deal.
It's a big deal.
Yeah.
And so you, as the opposing player, can have a card that says, okay, I want to stop them from doing that.
Yes.
You're going
Stop
to
it.
expend resources to do so. You're going to have to spend one of your resources to stop them from getting their additional resource on their next turn, and all the turns after that. Okay, so theoretically, in most instances, that's what you should do. It's a heuristic. It's a rule of thumb.
Why?
So
Okay.
the opportunity cost, as the game goes longer, right, if that bird survives and they're able to have that extra resource, on turn 2, they have 3 resources. On
Right.
turn
This is
turn
kinda what I was talking
3,
about
they
here.
have 4 resources. So they're a resource ahead of you not only on the next turn, but all the turns after that.
Yes.
Right.
So the longer you wait to kill that bird, the further ahead your opponent can get from
Yeah.
you.
The
And the less
benefits
valuable
you
that
get
bolt
of dealing
becomes.
3 damage are not nearly as strong as the benefits they get for potentially having a mana every
Right.
turn.
So there's an opportunity cost in this scenario, right? You have a lightning bolt.
And that's what I was talking about with the burn scenario, right? Where they're going to be ahead of you, and that lightning bolt on the bird becomes less and less valuable further and further on. Where if you tell yourself, I'm just going to bolt them, swing in with the goblin guy, they're not going to block. Like, I'm just going to pressure them on life, but then what if they reach their life gain spell faster? Then they outdo your spells. And then instead of having it later on where they're having to tap out on a crucial turn where maybe they might have an answer and have had like a counter spell to hold up. They now have to play this life gain spell, and then you are now free to do whatever you want on those turns. Like, as the game progresses, it becomes more complex. These things become less and less valuable on both sides, and the interactions change. And so it's really important to make the game predictable early, right? And this is something I talked about in a previous video where I reacted to them talking about tutors, where predictability is so important in a game of Magic the Gathering, where if you can force someone to play on your axis the way you want them to, then the game is much more in your favor. Even if you ultimately don't end up drawing the cards that you need, you still force them to play your game, and not they didn't force you. They force you to play your game. So predictability is key.
Well, that lightning bolt could be targeted towards the bird, right, with killing their extra resource, or you could deal 3 damage to them, right? You could take them from 20 to 17. Okay, so you've made the decision that, all right, I'm going to bolt the bird. The thing is, it's not always true. It's not always true that you should kill the Birds of Paradise with your lightning bolt.
Right.
I like this.
It depends on when that Birds of Paradise was played.
Right.
Was it played later in the game? Maybe it doesn't matter so much. Is your opponent at 5 health and you can deal 2 damage to them another way, and then you have 3 damage to just kill them?
Right.
There you go.
In that instance, don't bolt the bird.
Right.
So
exactly. Go for the win.
This is like a very simple scenario, which is infinitely complex in Magic, but
So speaking, like, they're going to go into how complex this is, but I think this is really important for people to understand that people get so, like, this is an interesting discussion about heuristics. People get so stuck up in them and general rules of thumb and like how they should play out, but that doesn't matter as the game evolves. Like in a scenario where he's talking about, in the beginning of the game, you bolt the bird. But in later game, you're like, okay, if I bolt them, I generally know for the information that I have that the chances of them drawing a life gain spell are low. They probably don't have it. So if I bolt them now, I'm likely to draw like a burn spell that's going to kill them. That's going to beat them, and then it's going to force the next game or just end the round, whatever. So going for the win can be really important, but these things are later game decisions. You can't make that game with the information now because you can't predict that many turns, but you can make good assumptive decisions based on 1 turn ahead, maybe 2 turns ahead. And that's the information where you can then use, okay, I'm not going to bolt the bird. I'm going to go for the win. These decisions are very different turn to turn in Magic.
As a rule of thumb, if you just listen to, okay, bolt the bird, then it's just not always true. You might do it in a scenario where using that lightning bolt in a different way is more advantageous. And this idea, this concept of when is it right to bolt the bird, when is it right not to, extrapolates to the entirety of the rest of the game, right? Yeah. Not only does this apply to counter spells or whether or not you should attack your opponent, it's foundational to the test of skill that is happening in Magic, right? Exactly. Rather than it being like, well, I can just memorize bolt the bird, so whenever I see a Birds of Paradise, I should just kill it. Well, it's not always true, right? Depending upon the scenario, depending upon how the game is unfolded, depending upon the situation that you're in and your opponent's in, that rule of thumb might be incorrect.
Yeah.
And so the test that is happening here, and what I think strategy actually is, in Magic, you have unknown information. You have your opponent has a hand of cards, you have a hand of cards, you don't know what's in their hand, and you get little clues of what might be in their hand. Maybe they have untapped mana. That lets you know, okay, they might be able to do these things. What might my opponent have?
Exactly. And this
How
is the
bad is it
predictability
for me
aspect
if
that I
they
was talking
have that
about.
thing? How can I make the best possible decision I can with having imperfect information? And I think that, one, this is just a great applicable skill to life in general, because life, it's that, like, you don't have perfect information. Mm-hmm. You have.
So I think this is okay. So and they may discuss this, but I talk about this with my friends and my wife and my loved ones and everything, and how this is really. So I, again, reiterating, this is a fantastic life skill, if I can speak, about working with the information that you have and making decisions based on that. Don't make decisions based on the worst case scenario, right? Because if that worst case scenario is not likely, if it is very low, then you don't need to worry about that. For example, you walk out the house, you're going to get hit by a lightning bolt. That is such a minuscule probability of that happen on a bright sunny day, but you could still have that fear. Are you not going to walk outside anymore? Are you going to cancel your, kind of date with your loved one? Are you going to cancel going out to your friend's house, meeting your parents, just because you're scared of getting lightning bolted out of the sky? Absolutely not. And this is how you should be making decisions in real life, right? Make high probability decisions so that your mental is a lot better, right? If you're and this can happen a lot with negative things. A lot of negative things that happen on a day-to-day basis are low probability things, and that's okay. You made decisions based on a high probability thing happening, and then you work on what's happening negatively there, just like in a game state. Yes, they drew the exact card that would work for them, but that's a low probability thing, and you made decisions up until the point of that game that allowed you to win if that didn't happen. And that's perfectly fine. If you keep doing that, statistically speaking, you will win the majority of more of your games of Magic than losing. And that I can guarantee you, because that's something the pros will tell you as well.
You have to make decisions all the time with imperfect information. But it also tests something that is beyond memorization, right?
Right.
It tests decision making. And that to me is what strategy is.
Right.
I don't think a game has to be as complicated as Magic to have this level of strategy.
No, Magic used to be much simpler, and it still had these heuristics. So.
Right. And so
Fire design.
The idea that part of it, though, like I think what gets attributed to this scenario is that the possibility space is so large that you can't have just a memorization, and I don't think that's actually correct. I think what's right is that there's imperfect information, right?
Right.
You don't need to necessarily have an infinite number of possibilities to create this scenario, right? You could just say, okay, well, I just don't know what my opponent has. It could be one of these 3 things.
Yeah.
How bad is it for me if it's this one of those 3 that I think it might be?
Right.
Right. If it is, then I shouldn't make this move. Is there a better move that I can make if they do have that?
Right.
Okay,
right. And you can create that with a much smaller possibility space.
Right. Like playing around like
That's
counterspells or something.
Yeah. I guess it is interesting how quickly just the hidden information and the variance can multiply all the different possibilities. I'm even thinking of the Bolt the Bird situation. Like
you just can't play around like your opponent having that spicy one of, right? Like you can't play around it. I think about, when you're playing against Mill, you can't always play around the fact that, especially in the early game when you're developing in Modern, you can't play around them having like, oh, they have 4 archive traps, I can't fetch. No, you're going to fetch. You're going to develop your game plan. Later in the game, you can, based on the information that you have. Like you notice that there is one card in the Mill player's hand that they consistently have not cast. I played creatures that they need to kill. I played spells that they need to counter. They have not interacted in any way, shape, or form. It's probably an archive trap, so I'm not going to search my library. So that is how you develop the information that you need. But I don't know if it's kind of that first statement about how there isn't like infinite possibility. It's just like imperfect information. I don't know.
So interesting that like you could even use a Bird of Paradise almost as a bait card and then play something like a Llanowar Tribe the next turn. I think it's 3 mana, but whatever. And that's going to give you like 3 extra mana or something. And that thing could also die from the lightning bolt.
Right.
So you're baiting the lightning bolt by playing this weaker thing, but you actually want this
taking
other
advantage
thing
of your opponent's heuristics.
Yeah. God.
Magic's great.
It's so good.
Magic is great.
But so let's talk about beginning and sort of layers of strategy, and maybe we'll come to another conclusion here. Is that okay? So when you first start playing Magic, you don't really understand all of the interactions of the game in its entirety.
Right.
But I actually think that's to Magic's detriment. I think that you could make the interactions much more simple, but you could get people to this space quicker, which is I don't know. I'm operating with imperfect information. I'm trying to make a decision based on what I think my opponent might have, and I'm getting hints of what they might have through. Oh, they have mana untapped. They have this stuff on the board. I can think about what they might have in their deck. Maybe they have additional copies of what's on the board.
Yeah.
Right.
You can get that out of the game without all of the different levels of interaction.
Yeah.
You can even get that without being able to play anything on your opponent's turn.
I guess I'm just wondering, like, is there a way that we can discuss how to design and implement heuristics into your games? Because I think you're right, is that it's going to be an outcome, right? People are always going to try and find the way of better optimizing their play
just
for a
general
particular
rules of
game.
thumb.
Right.
Don't play more than 60 cards.
I think what's difficult is making sure, if you want to have a competitive game, having that optimization have so many layers to it that it keeps those players interested, right? You don't want them to optimize the game into 3 layers and they go, oh, okay, like I just do these things and then I win every time.
Right. So
Exactly.
if we think about things at a like sort of a systemic level, like a systems level, right? The systems of Magic do not really change, right? It's
Okay.
resource management, and that interaction that we have with a Birds of Paradise and a Lightning Bolt is I have a solution that solves this now, and the bird, right, is my opponent investing in the future, right? So
Right.
my analysis in that situation is, do I want to use a resource that I can use once and use right now to stop my opponent from getting something that's going to help them longer term?
Right.
And so this idea
That's
of
an interesting way to think about it.
of that exact thing is that you need some things that do something right now for it, and have sort of a steeper cost, versus things that are investing in a long term.
Right.
And I think that's some of the foundation for what ends up like creating these heuristics.
Right.
Is that, well, in this moment, because I think my opponent can get a payoff for that thing, I want to.
So I think this is important, right? Like, you have a lot of hard and fast rules in Magic, like heuristics, like they're talking about. And honestly, a lot of ways, like, he's right in the sense that Bolt the Bird comes historically from what Birds of Paradise has done on turn 2, turn 3, turn 4. How far people have gotten ahead with a play like that. And with the trauma of losing games to stuff like that, that's why you say Bolt the Bird, right? It's kind of lived experience, and that's where these heuristics come from. And the idea that, right, like, you need to stop this because players before have experienced similar things. And with that information, with the general trends that they have, you have to get rid of it, right? Like, it's kind of like combo pieces. You're playing in Modern, you're playing against Yawgmoth. Plenty of players have lost to Yawgmoth being on the field, and if they untap what they have so much mana, like 5 cards in hand, they're going to win. So you have to kill that Yawgmoth on that turn. So similar ways to how you've used experience to make those decisions. You have to be fluid in those decisions, but you have to understand where they come from for other players. So when you pick up a new deck, why are people saying this? Because your understanding of this deck is one way based on the decks you've played, but the folks that already play and maybe make the primers, maybe grind with the deck, are very different. So you have to listen to that and understand why these rules are true, because the way they see the game is lensed differently than what you might have seen picking up the deck for the first time, picking up that card for the first time, or coming across that interaction
to stop it
for the
before
first
they
time.
get the payoff.
Yeah.
And all of those interactions are framed in that way, right? Counter spells, kill spells, direct damage. It's all framed in this is a resource that I can utilize now. How do I get the most out of it?
Right.
And you have to build systems that can facilitate these interactions. So
Yep.
without unknown information, these sort of things don't get to emerge, right? Because if I have perfect information, I'll know whether or not I should bolt the bird.
Right.
I'll know whether or not, oh, well, my opponent, like they'll have 3 resources on their turn 2, but turn 2, they don't have anything they'll have the 3 resources, but they don't have any good way to spend it.
Right.
So why would I need to deal with it?
Right.
I would know that information,
Right.
right? So without unknown information,
So a good way to think about this is on the play. You play Thoughtseize. You look at your opponent's hand. You see that they have a Birds of Paradise, but then no other plays from there. In this case, it's a bad example, but you would take the Birds of Paradise so that they can't do anything at any point. But maybe you see the fact that, hey, they don't have anything, and then there's actually like one spell that they have in their hand that if they resolve somehow, or they have a way to cheat it out, like they win the game there. You're going to take that, and at that point, they play the Birds of Paradise, and you're like, okay, I don't actually need to play my Fatal Push to kill the birds. They don't have a turn 2 play. I'm just going to then untap on turn 2, play a Tarmogoyf, and then advance my board state from there and apply pressure to them, because I know that they don't have an answer to this, or they have to play around having an answer to this, or a way to remove it. So in an example like that, where you have that quote-unquote perfect information, or it's imperfect because they're going to draw a card or 2 by the time these decisions happen, but stuff like that is where things like that can change in a kind
I
of
don't
real
think
Magic
that you
example.
get heuristics.
It's like you said, imperfect information or imperfect results of your choices, basically.
It's actually really funny because output variance gets a really bad.
It solves this. It's the same thing.
It's what this is.
You talk a lot about XCOM, and I think XCOM is a good example where when you can generally get a sense of the chances of you succeeding at a certain thing, right? Because XCOM shows the percentage chance of you being.
So they'll explain it. So I'm just going to try and like imagine it for everybody. Imagine a top-down battlefield. So for those of you who have not played XCOM, think of like different pieces moving along the board. You have units, and these units can move a certain amount of distance, and then they can deal damage a certain amount by a certain percentage. So, you know, you are 2 units that are right next to each other, and then your unit has a 50% chance to deal X damage to this unit at this distance. If you get closer, the percentage might increase. Of course, even if you are next to that unit and it is a 99%, there's still a 1% chance that you don't deal that damage, and that absolutely shatters the rest of the game, because then you might lose that unit based on what the enemy's unit does to your unit, because it's going to be turn-based. So that's why they're bringing up XCOM, and this is, I think, a good kind of chance of that, because you can't play to that 1%, like I was saying, right? You have to make decisions around that 99%, or maximizing the percent that you have with your information, and then making choices from there.
Being able to hit something,
Right.
then you're able to make those kind of same decisions of like, okay, what is the benefit of, you know, aiming at this thing that I have a 40% chance to hit,
Right.
or should I go and hit this thing that's 90% chance
Right.
to hit? What's going to give me the biggest reward?
Right. And I think where the most interesting stuff comes up in XCOM is, okay, I have a 80% chance to hit this thing. What is, if I miss, what's the worst thing that happens?
Right.
Do I have another person in my unit who can take another shot at that enemy? Or is it, if I miss this shot, that guy, that my guy is going to die, right? Like, they're going to then be able to melee attack me or something.
What
That's
I'm
a
saying,
huge drawback. And all of your decision making is framed around that way of thinking.
Yeah.
And that's all output randomness, right? That's all output variance. You're making decisions with imperfect information.
Right.
Yep.
And I think that is almost a necessity to strategy, is making decisions with imperfect information equals needing to build heuristics for these scenarios, understanding as much as you can about the situation, and then making the best decision you can based on the unknowns, the could-bes.
Right.
Yeah. And this is where, you know, I kind of want to highlight like what I was talking about before with going for the win, right? Like, and where these heuristics, people can get caught up in the rules and what you should do. You should play around the counterspell. You should play around the removal. But ultimately, you have to think about that long game scenario. Like, your goal is to win the game. And maybe as a mill player, your goal is to mill out your opponent's library. And then you think, oh yeah, last game I lost to the fact that they had 1 Spell Pierce, or they had 1 Flusterstorm. So how many spells do I have to play this turn to mill out or do this? And it's like, well, you have to think about the fact that, okay, maybe last turn I realized that they bounce this creature to their hand. Once they play that creature on their turn, I lose the game. So it doesn't matter if they have Flusterstorm or not, or how I can play around it. I have to play optimally to win the game, because my opponent's going to win the game next turn. That's one example. What about more on? They only have 1 copy of the Flusterstorm. They have like 30 cards left in deck. Or no, let's say they have like, I don't know, 26 cards left in deck. You can do one of 2 things. 26 cards. You have 2 archive traps in your hand. You can choose to Field of Ruin, archive trap them twice and go for the win, or you can choose to remove the creature that they have, because it's going to do a lot of damage to you and set you behind. But with that setting you behind, can you cast these archive traps later? Do you need to cast it right now? No. Well, maybe in that case, it's not necessarily like you're going to lose the game next turn. So don't cast these. Don't play into that. You don't need to win the game this turn. You can then remove the creature, force your opponent to do more, make actions on their turn, spend more mana, and then play around what they have. Maybe you then draw a counterspell that you can then use to counter the Flusterstorm that they have later. Understand where you're at in the game and realize, like, yeah, you need to go for the win sometimes, but like, just because you see the win doesn't mean you have to go for it. Use the game state and its situation to play around what you have, and don't go for the win if you don't need to, right? Go for what's better on board. Force your opponent to make more decisions, more actions, more cards, so that they have to use up more resources, and then you can make a decision once they have less resources if you're not being pressured. It's not just about going for it. If you're not losing, if you're not being pressured, don't just go for it. Because then once you don't have those options, your opponent has a bunch of options, you don't know where you're left. But that's what the video is. Thank you for everyone watching. Hope you all enjoying content like this. Let me know if you want to see me react to other videos out there. But I love this channel. I'm going to be definitely watching a lot more of their videos.